In today's video, I'm going to be sharing the answers to the most frequently asked questions that I get from beginner crocheters, plus my favorite tips that I really believe will give you the confidence that you're looking for with your crochet skills. Now, I'm not an expert, I'm just passionate about crocheting. I've been crocheting off and on for about 30 years now, and I love sharing what I've learned along the way to help simplify things, and most importantly, help to keep it fun. So with that said, in no particular order, let's just dive right in. Now, if you're watching this video, you're already applying my first tip, which is to watch as many of these videos as you can. Even if you notice that we all seem to give the same advice, don't be too fast to skip over it. If it's being repeated a lot, that probably means it's important. Plus, you may come across a small nugget of information that no one else has mentioned, and that is going to be the piece of the puzzle that really clicks for you. This happened to me a lot as I was learning how to knit. So I would also recommend that you save or bookmark the video because there may be tips that don't apply to you right now, but it probably will 6 months down the road, and you'll wish you'd remembered where you'd seen that particular tip. And while I have you bookmarking places, the next reference I highly recommend that you make sure you take a note of is the website for the Craft Yarn Council. This is an association that represents manufacturers and distributors of yarn used in knitting, crocheting, and other fiber arts. And this is your go-to source when you're looking for those acceptable standards in the industry. And I'll be referring to this website quite often throughout the video, so I just want you to keep it in the back of your mind. Okay, let's move on to the questions. Does the loop on the hook count as a stitch? That's a really good question, and no, it never does. Never, ever, ever. It is just there to help you form your next stitch. And then along with that, does the turning chain count as a stitch? Now this one can be confusing because as a general rule it's no, but then sometimes it is. Creating a turning chain means you're creating a group of chains that will help you reach the height of the stitch that you want to make. For single crochet, that would be 1 chain, a half double crochet, 2, a double crochet, 3 chains, and for a treble, it's 4. So when you're creating your foundation chain, you add those extra chains to make that very first stitch. For example, let's say we want to do a double crochet. You create your chain for the amount of stitches that you want to make, and then you add an additional 3, come back to that stitch to create your double crochet. And there is your very first stitch. And these little chains here on the side do not count. Now you may come across a designer or a pattern that says that that little turning chain does count as a stitch, but nowadays that's pretty rare. So I would just go under the assumption that it does not, unless it's otherwise stated. Now when you're working your turning chains in your rows, it's the same thing. They are just there to help you get the height you want for your first stitch. However, it is an acceptable standard that the chain 3 and the chain 4 can count as a stitch. And the way that works is you'll create your chain 3, turn your work, and then skip that very first stitch because that chain 3 is counting as a stitch, and then you'll create a regular double crochet into that second stitch. Now, like I said, this is very common and you'll see this in patterns, but over the years the popularity of that has gone down because it creates a little bit of a gap. So what a lot of crocheters do instead is they do a chain 2 and turn, just to get you a little bit of wiggle room to create a full double crochet into that very first stitch. So both ways are acceptable. It's really a personal preference. Okay, here's a big one. Why isn't my work straight? This is usually a tension issue, or you're accidentally adding or losing stitches along the way. Your tension is going to improve with repetition and practice, but there is one thing that you can do that will help improve this a lot. The starting chain is notorious for being tighter than the rest of your project. So your goal here is to work a little bit more loosely as you're creating your initial chain. But that can be a bit hard when you're first starting out and you're trying to figure out how loose it actually needs to be. So a good trick here is to create your chain with a hook that is at least a half to 1 full hook size bigger than the one you're going to be using for your project. In the first sample, I worked my chains with a 4mm hook and made them fairly tight. This makes it really hard for me to put my hook into the stitches, and look how it curls in when it's filled with the first row of stitches. Now, just from going from a 4mm up to a 5mm for that very first chain, look how straight it is. This is such an easy fix, and this isn't just for beginners. Advanced crocheters do this all the time. Another option is to use an inline crochet hook. Inline just means that the throat of the hook is the same width as the tip. So this is a great hook style if you have a tendency to crochet a little tightly. The next reason your work might not be straight is due to accidentally skipping or adding too many stitches. The easiest places to miss or add stitches is at the very beginning and end of the row. When you create your turning chain, pay attention to where it is as you turn. Adding a stitch marker will really help with this until you can easily recognize it, because you might accidentally add a stitch into one of those chains. And on the other side, the very last stitch is often tighter and smaller than the rest of the stitches and can be easily missed. And again, a stitch marker comes in really handy to put into there so you don't miss it. Another reason it's a little bit harder to see is because there's a little bump from the previous turning chain that kind of hides it as well. So again, a stitch marker can be your best friend with this. Here's a big tip to recognize where to put your stitch. When you're in doubt, just take note that the top of the stitch sits slightly to the right of the stitch, making it look like the letter P. That is the top of your stitch. Now sometimes that can be hard to see because it can get covered by other stitches, especially if you're working on something like a granny square. So just shift those stitches over and look for the letter P shape to find where your stitch needs to go. Counting rows are pretty easy when it comes to double and treble crochets. You can pretty much spot those out. But single crochets and half double crochets can be a little tricky. 2 rows of single crochets create a banding effect that is really easy to spot on the back side of your work, so I would start there. But another way to count your single crochets are by the vertical and horizontal lines that the stitches create. Notice here on the front of a single crochet there is a distinct vertical line moving up and down, and on the back side of a single crochet there is a horizontal line or a bump. I look for that vertical line, and then I look for the bump. Half double crochets have a significant look as well. They have these 3 lines that work together with one of them sort of on a diagonal. And then the back side of a half double crochet, it creates kind of an interesting braid-like effect as it's worked. This is what I use to count each row. How do I create a foundation border? A foundation border just means adding single crochets all around the edge of your blanket when you're finished. This is a great way to help get it ready for a more elaborate border, or just to help straighten out your blanket and make it look more finished. To do the top and bottom is pretty easy to do because you have distinct stitches there that are clearly visible to work into. But the sides can seem a little bit more complicated. So just like we were talking about for chains for each kind of stitch, you can do the same with single crochets. 1 single crochet for a single crochet, 1 to 2 single crochets for a half double, 2 single crochets for a double crochet, and 3 single crochets for a treble. This is just a general guide to fill those spaces. If it's making your side too wavy, then you can reduce your stitches, or if it's feeling too tight, then you can add more stitches. For your corners, I would recommend using an odd number, something like 3, 5, or 7, depending on how bulky your yarn is. For this demonstration here, I just did 3. The reason you want to use odd numbers is it helps keep the count accurate on the sides. A lot of you have reached out to me saying that you don't like reading patterns, you think it's complicated and hard, and I totally understand. I'm a visual learner as well, but I'm telling you, you want to learn how to read patterns and diagrams. Now, if you want me to create a video on how to read patterns, let me know. I'm happy to do so, but I do have a couple of tips here to get you started. First, you can visit the Craft Yarn Council website that I mentioned earlier, and they have some really great articles on how to read patterns. And also they provide the standard abbreviations and formatting that you'll typically see in patterns. Now, all designers are different, so they won't look exactly the same, but the formatting is very similar. The next thing I'd recommend is to find a pattern for something that you already know how to make, like a granny square, for example. Since you already know how to make it, just follow along with the written pattern just to see how it's structured to get a feel for it. You can do the same exercise with a diagram, and just get a feel of what that looks like as you're working on it. Now, while we're talking about patterns, I am going to slip in a little here about gauge. I know a lot of you are going to skip over this, and often I hear, do I really have to make a gauge swatch? No, not necessarily. If you're working on a blanket or something where the sizing is not crucial to the finished project, just make sure that you're using the same hook size and yarn weight that they're recommending, and you should be good to go. But, and this is a big but, if you're wanting to make something wearable, and I know a lot of you are, your future self will thank you for making a gauge swatch. Don't let this intimidate you. It takes about 10 minutes and it's just a sample to match up with what the designer has provided. Usually it's a 4x4 inch square made up with whatever stitch they're using. Let's say, for example, it's a double crochet. Grab a ruler or a tape measure, create your chain for that 4 inches, and then create your double crochets. Now just count the amount of stitches it took to get to 4 inches across and how many rows it took to get up to 4 inches high. Now, if your count came out bigger than the pattern, then you need to use a smaller hook and try again. If your stitch count came out smaller, then you need to use a bigger hook and try again. It's as simple as that. And then once you get it close, you can feel really confident with what you're making. Another question I get a lot is about yarn weight. Yarn weight just simply refers to the thickness of the yarn, and it ranges from super fine to super bulky and jumbo. Again, the Craft Yarn Council, the CYC, is a great resource for this. They have a chart that lists all the different yarn weights, as well as the different descriptions that it falls under, as well as the hooks recommended for it. A good rule of thumb here is that you don't want to mix and match yarn weights in a project. So for example, you don't want to create a blanket with a weight 4 yarn as well as a weight 5 yarn, because the look will not be consistent. And the same goes for the yarn type. And again, this can be quite confusing, but there are 3 different categories of yarn, and you want to stick to that same category for your project. You have your animal-based yarn, your plant-based yarn, and synthetic type yarns. And the reason you don't want to mix and match these is because they all have different traits and tendencies. So for example, you really don't want to create a blanket that has wool yarn in it as well as acrylic yarn, and that's because wool needs to be hand washed, where acrylic can be put in the washer and the dryer typically. So if you're wanting to make a wool blanket, then just make sure that all the yarn that you buy is made of wool. And it can be different brands. You just want to make sure that it's the same yarn type and the same yarn weight. So with all of that said, that is what you're really looking for on your yarn label. There's a ton of useful information on your yarn label, but you're looking mainly for the yarn type, the yarn weight, and the recommended hook size. I still get a lot of questions regarding how to weave in ends, and basically I like to do a 3-way pass, and that just means that I like to weave my ends in 3 times in opposite directions. I do have a detailed video regarding this that I'll go ahead and link here in a card above, but I also wanted to show you this fun little tip. If you're doing something with a lot of color work and you have a lot of tails left over, you can turn them into tassels. To create a tassel, you just want to wrap your yarn around a piece of cardboard or something that is the length that you want your tassels to be. You can make these as light or as chunky as you want. I just did 5 wraps around this measuring thing here, and this gave me a pretty nice tassel. Next, pull the yarn through the end of your crochet, pulling through from the back side. Create a small loop and pull the ends through that loop, including the tails that were already there. Now tighten and repeat. Easy peasy. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the tips helpful. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments and I'll be sure to answer them. I can even create short videos if necessary and add it to the playlist that I've already created to go along with this video. Keep me posted on how it's going. Be really patient with yourself. It is going to take some time for your brain and your hands to become friends and get the hang of this. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.